Why is the lighting so fucked up in here? Have you ever had an idea that has been percolating in your brain for a long time and you can't get it out? Well, I have had that feeling too, and I finally got it out. So this is my attempt to get a lot of words out on a topic that I've been passionate about for literally the last couple years. Funk McLovin's Homestuck in the South. This is what it's all about. This is my grand unified theory of Homestuck, all compiled in this format. And it is intentionally alienating, it is intentionally confusing, and I thought, how the fuck am I going to convey this to people in a way they understand? Well, guess what? I decided not to, because Homestuck doesn't do that either. And if you see on my shirt here, who's that typing away? Who's that? Who's that on my shirt typing to their pen pal? That's Data Wi-Fi, mascot of SOCON. Not SOCON D's Nuts, Stuck at Home Con, which is a little online convention hosted by Yo It's Crow and Janiyah Riley and all those other wonderful people who you've probably seen around on either Twitter or my channel or something. And I just wanted to say thank you for coming out. If you didn't come out for SOCON, then you came out for me. And either way, I appreciate that. So without further ado, please enjoy Homestuck in the South. And then I put a little reverb on that, and there's a sparkly effect on there. All right, folks, fuck this.
And now, our feature presentation.
Who are you? Have you ever looked in a mirror long enough to become creeped out? Who are you? Do you remember the first time you heard your voice on a recording device? How did you feel? Who are you? Does it bother you that you can control your arms and legs, but something else is silently making your heart pump and your brain release chemicals? Who are you? Self-awareness is a bitch. Once you realize you exist, you become a complete mystery to yourself. Once you understand that you are a person who's just like the persons around you, everything you took for granted seems to evaporate into smoke. You start thinking about questions that are entirely unrelated to any biological survival function, like purpose and being and consciousness. Once you begin to find these answers, you learn such terrifying things as the subconscious and the superego and the fight-or-flight response, things built into your body that you didn't choose, things that seem to operate without your input. Is free will real? Are we just meat sacks made of atoms and molecules? Who are you? But even beginning to think about any of this, we have to subdivide ourselves. We have to understand that the moment-to-moment experience of conscious thought that forms our essence is fundamentally different than our biological bodies. If consciousness is where the feedback is leading to, the body is where it is coming from. We're just formless nothings, being told stories in chemicals by meat, operating the arms and legs of flimsy bone suits. Who are you? None of these observations are new, of course, but so rarely do we go beyond this surface-level realization that we aren't ourselves, yet we are all we can be. We see truth and passively accept it. After we understand self-awareness, we simply meander back into life, going to school, eating cheeseburgers, and reading webcomics. But there's one piece of media that isn't satisfied with that. It's Homestuck. Of course it's fucking Homestuck. Sheesh. Who are you? In real life, we can't meet ourselves. If we could, perhaps we'd finally understand ourselves a little better, or perhaps understanding how we look and act would drive us mad. The phenomenon of self-awareness isn't the same for everyone. It's actually remarkably subjective. Perhaps some of you listening might find it very intriguing to meet yourself. Perhaps others would find it repulsive, and perhaps more would feel so strange that you'd never want it to happen at all, even if it were possible. Homestuck, on the other hand, isn't real life. This might be news to some of you, But in Homestuck, people meet themselves all the dang old time, from Dave's time clones to the Vriska and parenthesis Vriska showdown, to the Aradiabot's sacrifice, to whatever the fuck is going on with Dirk. People in Homestuck are, furthermore, iterations of themselves, Rose and Dave being genetic clones of Dirk and Roxy, the Dancestors being iterations on the ancestors, and again, whatever the fuck is going on with Dirk. And it's all rather in the background, isn't it? This paradox multiverse of guys meeting themselves and each other is just a facet of the story that happens by coincidence. But if we chase down these times where people in Homestuck meet themselves and what they do and how they feel, we can discover something about ourselves in real life. It's all a confusing miasma of selfhood and ego, broken down to its barest essentials, wrung dry of meaning, and inspected with a fine-tooth comb. You know, like whatever the fuck is going on with Dirk. Now, I ask once again, who are you? Like Virgil, I shall now be your guide through the rings of hell. Instead of 9, thankfully, there are only 3 this time. My mercy is my greatest virtue. The first level of self-awareness Homestuck hell is the ring of literally the same guy. In other words, an alternate version of a genetically identical person. We'll get into the nuances of genetic identicality later, so don't you worry. The second level is the same guy, not literally the same person, but a person with some additional or subtracted attribute. The final and most horrible, confusing level is the same different guy, or the type of guy who is one guy but isn't. More on this later. You're not ready yet. Be patient. We'll also be using some terms in this piece that I want to get on the same page about from the get-go, so no one gets confused and this doesn't become some philosophical circle jerk. The first and foremost thing I'd like to outline is my use of guy in this video. I use guy as the catch-all term for person or being or ego, but also person in terms of their personal consciousness. So if you ever hear me say guy, that's what I mean. With that nonsense sorted, here's some other actual terms. If you're familiar with Plato, you might be familiar with the concept of forms. If you're not familiar with Plato, let's say that everything in the universe has some essential set of traits. For example, we recognize a diverse array of apples to be participating in what we would call the form of apples, a sweet round fruit that is either red, green, or yellow. The ultimate self, then, is the form in which alternate selves participate to be recognized as their selves. As an example, we recognize Dirk as wearing triangle shades and being calm of demeanor. In this way, we also recognize Bro and Arqueus Sprite to be participating in Dirkness, even if they're missing certain traits of Dirkness, with Alpha Dirk being a sort of Dirk godhead, if you're familiar with Eckhart. If you're not familiar with Eckhart, the godhead, simply put, is the being in which every facet of everything that participates in a form constitutes, or, in other words, Dirk is the Dirk godhead because he forms our understanding of every other Dirk. The ultimate self, then, is less of a hypothetical conglomeration of selves, as HS2 would have you believe, and more of a hypothetical mass of traits which are recognizable as a being. As discussed, humans, to perform self-awareness, must separate themselves from their bodies to understand that they exist. This separation creates 3 things. Our consciousness is the feedback experienced by our bodies, converted into the raw, mundane material of what we, in short, experience. It's what we see. It's what we hear. It's how we exist. We largely take this for granted, and while it's hard to define, you, by nature of having one, understand what a consciousness is. This understanding creates a personal self, a self that is experiencing things moment to moment, or your body's pilot, so to speak. It's you in the literal sense, the you that would still be you if you lost your memories or swapped bodies with your pet cat. The mundane you, the you that is seeing and feeling and hearing. The other self it creates is the existential self, the self of humanity, the self of memory, the self that you see in the mirror, the self that necessitates stories being told about your past and history, your face, your hands, your heartbeat, the one that you can observe. And then there's the id, ego, and superego. Come on, you all know this. It's the shit that Freud came up with. It's bunk in psychology, but for our purposes, understanding these three is useful. Id is the summation of your desires acting upon you, your hunger, your thirst, your horniness. Ego is your concept of self, the way that you understand your being to be. It's your you. Superego is your perceived place in the world and how you try to adjust to it. It's the external that acts upon you. This is, of course, an oversimplification, but it is the extent which we need these concepts in this video. In Homestuck, there are broadly three fields of science. 1. Alchemy, or the study of the inanimate. This, for our purposes, is largely irrelevant, but a video on its own could and should be made about it. 2 is magic, or the study of the unexplainable and arcane. This too is irrelevant, because as we all know, magic isn't real. 3, ectobiology. Ectobiology is the genetic code of human beings, essentially the study of a person's specific metaphysical makeup. If we say someone is ectobiologically identical, we mean that not only are they biologically identical, they are also the same across every metric. This ectobiology is malleable and changeable, but we'll get into the specifics later on. Another Homestuck mechanic that bears mention is time travel. Homestuck's time travel is another topic worth a deep dive, but for a gross oversimplification, there are 2 different time travel modes in Homestuck: alpha-compliant and retcon time travel. While Homestuck's narrative does not consider retcons time travel, for our purposes, it's time travel. Alpha-compliant time travel works thusly. If your future self gives you a penny, you must eventually, at a later date, travel back in time to give yourself that penny. If you do not, this creates a paradox. Once you time travel, you create a fated action that, if not completed, will cause a paradox and become an invalid timeline. If, for example, you forget to give your past self the penny, that penny can't exist, and paradox space destroys your timeline after a certain amount of time. Incidentally, for those of you wondering where the penny came from or worrying about such irrelevant things as the bootstrap paradox, the penny becomes a magical item called a juju with no origin or endpoint. But I digress. For time travel buffs out there, it's determinism with free will added. The Bill and Ted version of time travel mechanics. Time travel with determinism that you can fuck up. Retcon time travel works very differently, where past events can be tweaked to create a new timeline, irrespective of paradoxes. Sort of. There's more to it than that, but for our purposes, that's good enough. Also, let me level with the people who don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. That's fine. This video can just be like a list of people who sometimes meet themselves in Homestuck. That's fine if you want to experience it like that. But with that groundwork covered, let's get into it. Before we begin this road into madness, let's discuss how characters can be the same. Let's start very broadly. To recap, literally same guys are guys who are identical in every way except perhaps their circumstances. They are the same guy, literally. But there are some same guys who are more same than others. In the game of Spurb, the people who play the game obtain doppelgangers in the form of dream selves. These are the highest form of literally the same guy, because they are not only the same person in discrete bodies, but they share one singular consciousness. A good example of this is Jade coming to terms with her dream self being real through seeing a taxidermized corpse in her attic. Since every troll and human kid has a dream self, let's table this for now. There are only a few dream selves that become their own distinct entities. Another instance of literal same guy are the different iterations of the various Spurbian chess guys. Spades Slick, Black Queen, etc. all presumably are the same guy when a Spurb session begins. More on this later too. Another example of literal same-guyness are the various Paradox Doom clones of all the characters seen in Act 6 onward within Dream Bubbles. These are a little different because they don't always stay literal same guys, but at the time of their timelines diverging, they are the literal same guy as the Alpha Timeline variant. An example of this is Dave Sprite, who shares most of Alpha Timeline Dave's memories up until the point of divergence. He becomes a different guy, but he begins as literally the same guy. There's also Dream Dead John, who dates Parenthesis Vriska for a little bit. He doesn't meet real John, so he won't be discussed here, but he's literally the same guy as Main John until later when he gets double killed by Lord English. If you're confused by now, hold on to your ass. Another example of literal same guys are Dave and Aradia's time clones, though these are different. In Aradia's case, they're doomed guys, who we've discussed, but in Dave's case, they are literal future and past selves of himself. In a way, Dave is the only character except for John who well and truly meets himself, a version of him who is, ostensibly, him. John's meeting comes with his retcon powers, when he has to stop a past self from doing something, whereas Dave meets himself when he's navigating the intricate dance of alpha-compliant time travel. All of these types of guys in Homestuck could be understood as alternate selves or time-displaced selves, respectively, but all of them represent a version of the self that is identical except for minute changes. We also see this through the two main ways Homestuck considers guys to be similar. One, in their ectobiological makeup, and two, in their pasts. Generally, all guys who are the same somehow share some portion of their past to a point. But let's move on from this. We've discussed guys who are literally the same, but let's now diverge a little and discuss guys who are only one layer of literally the same. As stated before, a person who diverges from a shared past becomes someone else. But what happens when those people's actions diverge wildly? How different are you if you choose a red shirt in the morning versus the you that chose, for instance, to go on a killing spree? The most emblematic example of this is Vriska and Parenthesis Vriska. These are two people with the same history who have not changed at all ectobiologically, but they are now different people. More on them specifically later on. Another extreme example of this are alpha and beta selves of the 8 Suburb kids. For example, Alpha Bro and Dave are the same guy, even though all they share is having been created by John on the medium meteor. They are less same guy than Vriska and P. Vriska, but they are still the same guy, as they are the same, ectobiologically speaking. This same goes for Dancestors and Ancestors. They are presumably also genetic copies, just raised on different iterations of the troll planets. Same for the main trolls and the hypothetical ancestors of the Dancestors. The different Jacks also begin as the same guy, being the same gameplay construct playing out different histories. These are the least same of guys, while still being literally the same because they do not share a history at all, just ectobiologically. So we understand sameness as a spectrum here. We have different levels of sameness, from the consciousness-sharing dream selves to the identical but different functional Jacks. Yet we still have not breached non-literal levels of sameness. Or, to summarize that in a less insane way, let's talk about what we have so far. People in Homestuck can be said to be the same person by two vectors. One, a shared past and memories, or two, by their similarities in ectobiology. If two subjects are the same ectobiologically, they can be understood to be literally the same. Literally in this case meaning literally, because they're in literature. With that out of the way, let's discuss some major instances of people interacting with people who are literally themselves, and what they can tell us about our real-life selves. Dave Strider, out of every character in Homestuck, meets the most number of himselves numerically. He is also the most at ease around himself. Throughout Acts 4 and 5, we see him quickly master the art of time travel to achieve a very sophisticated system of using his time clones to be in many places at once. There are sometimes dozens of Daves on screen, especially during his dealings in the Lohack Stock Exchange. He is shown to have a great trust for himself, like when he is speaking to Terezi about something he's unsure about, he sees one of his future selves giving him a thumbs up, which immediately mollifies his worries. Unlike Aradia, the other time player, Dave's alternate selves that he interacts with are not doomed. This means he is in harmony with himself, planning out when to become his future selves and how to help his past selves. It's all portrayed as a very delicate and elegant dance. He also uses his power for two very complicated jobs. First, to manipulate the Lohack Stock Exchange in his favor, and second, to help Jade collect frogs to create the Genesis Code. Dave has a high degree of comfort around himself. This doesn't necessarily imply a large ego nor self-confidence, since Dave is depicted as sort of insecure, but it does imply a harmony with himself that a lot of other characters completely lack. Dave is shown to know himself and trust himself unconditionally. There's a lot of pressure, exemplified by how stressful it is to maintain alpha compliance, which gives a very nuanced sense of his self-worth. Notably, Dave gives up his time powers in Act 6 because he seems to feel anguish over being in danger of dooming himself by overuse of his power. This shows a great maturity and very disciplined self-care. It takes a very strong person to know when something empowering is hurting them. The reason for this is a tremendous degree of self-sufficiency. He cares for himself because under Bro's care, he only had himself to fall back on. Far from being isolating, this is liberating for him, even allowing him to make new friends like Terezi and help his friend Jade with his self-harmony. Wow, Dave is pretty cool after all. This is in brutally stark contrast to Aradia. Aradia's time clones are sacrificial lambs summoned from doomed timelines to waste their lives by suicide bombing Aradia's enemies. Aradia's relationship to time is much more brute force. It's hard to imagine Aradia weaving her selves together like Dave does, because that wouldn't be enough firepower for her. She seems to have sparse care about her alternate selves until later in the comic, when she destroys her robot self and becomes God tier. All the Aradia bots also accept their fate, showing that they do not value their collective life. This is of course until Aradia, now no longer a robot, speaks to one of her doomed selves in the dream bubbles, the Homestuck afterlife, seeming to make peace with her being. Even so, after this, she essentially relinquishes her control, preferring to situate herself passively and watch the world burn. Aradia then has two extremes: extreme active destruction and extreme passive observation. She shows us someone who has the same powers as Dave and reveals a very different relationship to how they see themselves through how those powers are used. Between these time players, we see the most direct interaction with the self, Aradia and Dave dealing in direct mirror images instead of more varied and different reflection of Homestuck's different selves. They are empowered to, through the use of time manipulation, to use their self as a tool, and their choices on how to use that tool reflect how they think. If you could use time powers like they do, would you be a Dave or a Aradia? Careful, safe utility, or brash, dangerous firepower? Another variety of time interaction is Karkat's memos in Act 5. These are the most direct example of someone talking to himself, since Aradia nor Dave really talk to their past selves directly that often, but at the same time, it's probably the most adversarial. That is perhaps with exception to the final example, which we'll get to shortly. Karkat's metaphor is perhaps the most straightforward in terms of its portrayal. He experiences a very deep and potent self-loathing. Each time he speaks to a version of himself, without fail, he experiences an almost involuntary anger. He spirals into these loathing monologues with himself about how much he despises his non-alter ego with a simultaneous sense of smug superiority. Uniquely, however, Karkat doesn't stop hating himself by making peace with himself, like the stereotype would dictate, but instead in refusing to engage with himself. He brings his ego peace not by peacemaking, but by avoidance. Once he stops making those fucking memos, he manages to be happy. Through Karkat, we see that we undermine ourselves. Freud might call this cognitive dissonance, but I call it ordinary self-loathing. Sometimes we do just really hate ourselves, and the way through that is not to engage in the self, but instead more passively choose to accept ourselves. It's mundane and rather ordinary, but it's how to stop self-hatred, to actively choose to just stop. Don't respond to the memo. You are who you are now, not the one who made a mistake a moment ago. The fourth and most interesting case of self meeting self is Vriska meeting parenthesis Vriska in Act 6. These two instances of Vriska are the same person, but each one has a dividing event in their recent past that was formative for opposite reasons. Vriska was not killed for her crimes on the meteor, but parenthesis Vriska was. Essentially, P. Vriska had to face her crimes and engage in retribution, whereas Alpha Vriska was affirmed for her crimes by becoming the main character of the meteor for those 3 years in John's retcon session. The two Vriska's interaction in late Act 6 is somewhat jarring and a major event in Vriska's trajectory as a character. For more info on this, please watch the Vriskumentary. The short version is, parenthesis Vriska, through allowing herself to let go of her wish to be narratively relevant, has grown significantly as a person, achieving a great deal of happiness through means that are very different to her original coping mechanisms. But then again, after this growth, Alpha Vriska, who essentially represents a regression of P. Vriska's self, shows up and relentlessly mocks her. Oddly, however, P. Vriska is remarkably affected by Vriska's mockery, an inversion of the usual tropes. Usually, after character growth, a person should reap the positive rewards of a more fulfilled life, but parenthesis Vriska gets her girlfriend stolen. This is poignant. We've all looked back to a past version of ourselves and in some way idealized it. We have been yelled at by our past selves in that way. We have said to ourselves, I used to be more confident, or I used to have a boyfriend, or I used to work out more. And Vriska's potent mockery reflects this tendency of feeling inferior to ourselves as we used to be, no matter how much progress we've made. For Homestuck, this is surprisingly sophisticated. It shows us that growth is not something that happens to us, but something that must be justified to ourselves, sometimes constantly. No matter how much we grow, something has to be let go. Another someone reflects on someone who is literally them but worse in Dirk and Dave discussing Dave's brother. As we know, Bro is Dirk's ecto-clone. They are the same guy in different timelines. Dirk, somewhat understandably, has a lot of regrets and feels responsibility towards Dave for mistreating him in another life. Dave sees this differently, because Dirk and Bro, to Dave, are different people. He's right, of course. Just because they're the same guy doesn't mean they're the same person. Bro was raised in a completely different circumstance, and despite a clear resemblance, Dave is more than happy to embrace his ecto-brother. Again, this fantastical scenario can remind us of something. We often compare ourselves to what could have been, either favorably or unfavorably. Dirk's situation feels alien yet oddly familiar. Who hasn't had an intrusive thought that has alarmed us? Who hasn't felt guilt over something they didn't do? I felt guilty for days after daydreaming about stealing my friend's Pokemon cards. I also feel guilty for not being able to be myself to get into a better college. I also feel guilty that I'm still in a fucking Homestuck. Dirk is comparing himself to himself, but even such a comparison is nothing but an illusion. Dirk is Dirk, I'm me, you're you. Even if you're the same guy, even if you've had those thoughts, they're just thoughts. It's illusory. Through these lenses, Dirk, Dave, Aradia, and Vriska, we can start to see a great deal of nuance between different ways people can experience self-awareness. Critically, these examples underline how self-awareness is not always an active process. It is less something that is achieved and more something that must be seen through. The actionable question, then, what we can ask ourselves is, how are we viewing ourselves? Are we, like Dave, healthy and responsible with ourself, or are we self-destructive like Aradia, lost in illusion, or like Dirk? There exists a theory in psychology, more of a concept diagram, really, called the two-center hypothesis. Keep this in mind, we'll return to this later on. These two centers in the hypothesis are a ring, which comprises the self, but in the center there is a dot, representing the strictest self, the experiences and ego that comprise one person as they are moment to moment. To come face to face with that is what characters of Homestuck often have the pleasure to face, unlike us in the real world. We can see these characters struggle not just with identity as it exists, but the love and hatred of the things that make us up. Through these examples, we can see that self-respect does not begin with love. Dave can often be a very nervous, even at times self-loathing person, yet he does what he needs to be done to preserve his place in the universe. The question is, how do you see yourself? Who are you? We've discussed when people literally meet themselves, but what about when people only meet themselves? If the nuance is lost on you, let me explain. When Dave meets a time clone, he's meeting himself in the same context you'd normally experience his own self. When Vriska meets Vriska, she is meeting someone from a different path. What about when Dave meets Dave Sprite? When do people stop being themselves? Much like in the previous section, there is something of a spectrum of self that we have to operate with. There are two extremes of the not-quite selfhood, the ectobiologically distinct and the quasi-related. We've discussed how trolls like Arania and Mindfang, by virtue of sharing ectobiology, are the same guy, but what about cases like Vriska and Mindfang? They share some ectobiology. What are they? Or what about Rose and Jaspero's Sprite Squared? Rose and JRS share a history and some ectobiology, but they're clearly separate people. And most of all, what happens when these distinct selves interact? So let's run down them all to set the groundwork for the interesting conundrums. There are numerous characters who are iterations of themselves coexisting with a more base version of themselves. Examples include Dave Sprite and Dave, Jade Sprite and Jade, who later merge into God-tier Jade, Rose and Jaspero's Sprite Squared, Dirk and AR, and Dirk and Arqueus Sprite. These are rather mundane and present an additive notion of character. Some sprites, like GCat Tavros Sprite Squared, aren't included because they don't coexist with another version of themselves. Another example is the Dancestor phenomenon, not just in relation to the trolls. Bro and Dave, for example, share ectobiology. Dirk's ectobiology is the base, combined with Roxy, making Dave in both his alpha and beta forms, an iteration on both Roxy and Dirk. Dave and Dirk meeting is a meeting of the self. This goes for all the main families, i.e. John, Jade, Jane, and Jake, and their iterations, as well as Roxy, Dirk, Dave, and Rose, and their iterations. This creates a rather dense but comprehensible family tree, comprised entirely of cloned alters. The third and final example are people who are versions of themselves that appear later yet coexist. The main example, of course, is Caliborn and Lord English, as they both coexist due to time shenanigans, but a more potent example is Mina and the Condes. The different Jack Noirs also become distinct enough to be different persons later on, and in fact fight one another. These two examples show us that, like in the first section, second-level sameness can develop from first-level sameness, if that makes sense. If it does not make sense, I'm so sorry. So, to recap, when characters are the same guy but not quite, there are different nuances of how this occurs, largely based in two camps. One, when characters undergo a change to become different fundamentally, like Dirk and AR, and two, when characters share something fundamental but aren't the same, like Mina and Condi. I would call these convergent and divergent iterations if I were pretentious. Luckily, I'm not. Now then, let's take a peek at some characters who meet themselves, but not quite. The quintessential example of this, and perhaps the most thematic of all of these self-meetings in Homestuck, is the fraught relationship between Dirk and his autoresponder, Lil Hal. Dirk initially creates his autoresponder for a somewhat innocuous purpose, to have something that he can answer his messages for him, for when he's not around. This continues his theme of being someone who likes to be in control. Sadly, this effort backfires somewhat. AR quickly goes from a simple utility to a character in his own right. He's created by Dirk as an ectobiological clone of his own brain, put inside a pair of shades. The macabre horror of this, of course, is that AR has Dirk's memories up until his 13th birthday, and has, for 3 years, been essentially a human being trapped inside shades. Dirk finds it difficult to face AR for two main reasons. The first is immense guilt because he, as himself, is uniquely equipped to empathize with a version of himself trapped in a senseless void. The second reason is because Dirk immensely resents AR because he's inadvertently made a facet of himself that he can't control. AR begins to manifest things about himself like typing in red and using phrases Dirk does not, like it seems. Many people in Homestuck use the word splinter, and we might first understand this to mean that AR splintered from Dirk, but quickly we as readers realized that Dirk himself has basically been splintered in the creation. This whole plot with AR is largely in the background of Homestuck until late Act 6, with a discussion between the two of them where Dirk threatens to kill Lil Hal, and Hal must literally beg for his life. The ultimate tragedy of this is how Hal says in no uncertain terms that he fully sympathizes with Dirk, being the same guy. Ultimately, Dirk relinquishes AR to become his own person, namely by combining with Equius as a sprite, and becoming everyone's favorite character, Arquius Sprite. One of the most underrated guys in Homestuck. Dirk's feelings about Lil Hal represent a very real sense of self-hatred that is endemic to the human condition. Jesus Christ, that was a fucking pretentious sentence. Sure, we can't literally scan our brains to make autoresponders, but we struggle when a part of our executive function fucks up. We hate it when we don't feel like ourselves. When we fail to wake up on time, we might experience a unique form of regret where we have to deal with personal consequences of something we didn't personally do. We also feel through Dirk and Lil Hal the slow divergence of our own selves. People change. We're not the same person we used to be, and it's easy to conceptualize a wide variety of ways that can be. Unlike us, Dirk sees these other selves literally, and can resent them. Dirk's struggles with the self don't end with Hal, however, as he is plagued with many alternate selves, such as Jake's brain ghost Dirk, who he feels like he can't measure up to, symbolizing how we can see ourselves as perceived by others and come to feel out of step with how others see us. In summary, the main struggle of Dirk Strider as a person is the way that he is simultaneously sure of who he is and in control, yet so plagued by doubts. We sometimes assume that there is some state of being that exists without doubt or pain, that our identities can somehow be solidified, but such a thing is false. There will always be intrusive thoughts and things that we think that only we can see, things that may cause intense distress and guilt. Homestuck tells us through Dirk, essentially, that we are not our internal selves, not completely. We're what we do, not what we think. It's comforting, meaning that we never have to claim our own internal thoughts, but it's also salient because it means that we can't simply have private thoughts. We must act. This is reinforced through Jade and Jade Sprite. They are both a mirror of Karkat in late Act 5 when Jade gets annoyed by Karkat's incessant arguing with himself. Jade Sprite's existence is brief, but it can show us how we can sometimes be stymied by our own advice. We get annoyed with people for doing things we recognize. Dirk and Jade both dislike recognizing things about themselves in alters and others. We've gone on about Dirk long enough, though. Let's talk about a broader topic, like Dancestors. I've said Dancestor throughout this video, but for those who forgot, what is a Dancestor anyway? It's a portmanteau of descendant and ancestor, but that's not really correct. It refers to the phenomenon in paradox space when there is an alternate universe version of someone's descendant and/or ancestor. It implies peerhood. For example, Dave and Dirk are Dancestors because Dirk is an alternate version of his own brother, who is his peer. The most common pool of Dancestors are the main trolls and the Before Us trolls, interacting in Middle Act 6. These are 12 sets of Dancestors, so I'm not going to exhaustively discuss them, only the ones who meet their counterparts or have a significant relationship with them somehow. For the most part, all Dancestor pairs who do meet up reveal a few different facets of the human tendency to recognize the self in the other. As Dancestors are very similar, there's an immediate visceral response in the characters when they meet. I'll discuss how each pair reacts to seeing themselves in the other and how it reflects on humanity. Also, if you're wondering why I'm saying humanity when these are trolls, it's because the story was written by a human. Dummy. The biggest Dancestor pair is inarguably Arania and Vriska, as they are the only pair to do things past the confines of Open Bound. Vriska and Arania get along because they have the same goals, but they don't entirely get along, mostly embodied in their relationship with Mina. Vriska and Arania are, in simple terms, two people with identical goals but the polar opposite personality. Vriska is brash and straightforward, while Arania is more contemplative and plan-oriented. They're both long-winded and self-righteous, but even in this similarity they are different. Mina also has a close bond with both circuit girls, Arania because of their shared past and mutual admiration, and Vriska because of how exciting Mina finds Vriska. Vriska sees Arania as boring and worth ridicule, much like she considers anyone who isn't as strong as she is. Arania is an annoyance, but she recognizes Arania's exceptional skills nonetheless. Arania sees Vriska as a loose cannon, but ultimately admirable, especially because of Vriska's built-in adoration for Arania's alternate self, Mind Fang. The two are in a sort of toxic feedback loop when they learn horrible lessons from each other. Vriska instills in Arania a devil-may-care attitude that leads directly into game over, and Arania strips away Vriska's care, making her apathetic and detached, leading Mina to reject her. For humanity, when we recognize ourselves in others, we have a very inbuilt response. Human social groups are built around niches. We sense the niche we fill in a group and feel a very potent threat when that position is challenged. Vriska and Arania fill that same niche, especially as it regards to Mina, and so they have to become competitive to jostle for that niche, which causes problems. But jostling for a niche isn't always bad. For example, Kanaya and Porum face a very similar clash. They are, while quite different, the same in that they are both maternal towards their friends. Kanaya also feels threatened because Porum is more adept at being a troll vampire. But instead of feed off one another negatively, Kanaya and Porum come together and begin to redefine themselves in a more precise way. Unlike Arania and Vriska, who jostle for position, Kanaya and Porum rightfully see that there's room enough for them both, so long as they create new niches for themselves. Porum teaches Kanaya to better understand her vampirism, they exchange fashion tips, and after meeting Porum, we see Kanaya shift from a maternal presence to a more self-confident and forthright person. She saw herself in a new light through someone else. In these two examples, when a person recognizes the other, they've had a competition for a niche. But in the case of Karkat and Cancri, something very different occurs. For Karkat, meeting Cancri is something of a revelation to him. For the first time, Karkat sees the niche he fills, and instead of double down on his niche like Kanaya or Vriska, he utterly rejects it. He is so disgusted in seeing someone embody the ways he values himself that he changes drastically. Cancri is a blowhard, a self-righteous monologuing fool, something that shocks Karkat. After talking with Cancri, Karkat seems to retreat from the spotlight, giving up his status as the leader. This is to his benefit, as he's able to pursue his friendships and be less horrible to be around. Cancri doesn't really learn much from Karkat, sadly. It's a little sad that Karkat's reaction was so strong, as Karkat was, in the end, a good leader for the particular group he was in charge of. But we've all met someone that we know we've acted like who makes us cringe. Arguably, the entire concept of cringe could be said to originate from that recognition of the self in others. The final main reaction of the Dancestors that we see is between Gamzee and Kurlos. Kurlos chooses to form a new niche, much like Karkat, but his choice is to become entirely subservient to Gamzee. This is more for story reasons, but it's also easy to see how one might become a little browbeaten when meeting an alternate self. The concept of the ego is sometimes abstracted like a mirror. We see who we are as we are, having knowledge of our deepest thoughts. However, we sometimes conceptualize ourselves more like a funhouse mirror, how we could be or how a distortion is of what we are. These examples of people recognizing the self in the other in Homestuck are an example of this. Back to the idea of the two selves hypothesis, the people in this section are meeting themselves as expressed through not the center ego, but in the broad ephemeral sense of ourself, not as ego, but as one contiguous being with long-term plans and ideas. This, while broader and perhaps more accurate than ego in the middle, is largely unknowable, only perceptible by whatever sliver we focus on. The selves seen in Homestuck being these slivers that the characters are fixated on in some way. We can see their senses of self. We can also see that our sense of self isn't always very accurate, as with Dirk and Karkat. It's highly doubtful that Karkat sees himself in a similar way, even to his closest friends, and Dirk's self-concept borders on delusion due to the sheer amount of times he is forced to see himself expressed in others. So, we've discussed guys who are the same, literally, and guys who are the same, but what about guys who are the same, but completely different? Who are they? And more importantly, who are you? Sometimes, two guys are the exact same guy. Sometimes, they're the same guy but not. What about when two guys, despite being the same guy, are completely different? Or in Homestuck terms, what if people only share a small portion of their being ectobiologically or historically with someone else? In other words, even when two people are the same, when do they stop being the same guy? Luckily, no real person will ever have to deal with this question. We talked before about Dirk and Arqueus, but only as it pertained to Lil Hal, so let's get more into that. Unlike with Lil Hal, Dirk seems more confused than repulsed. Ark is a completely new guy now, but he's still Dirk in at least some sliver. This to Dirk means instead of having to struggle with Ark, he can simply reject him. It's cathartic, perhaps in a negative sense, but Dirk finally sees where his selfhood ends, and in seeing the limit, he's equipped to more accurately grapple with himself as a self. Gee, I hope that the writers of future Homestuck projects don't completely fuck up all of this character growth on the part of Dirk. Anyway. Much like Ark with Dirk, Rose also experiences a doppelganger spritification, where her dead game over self is prototyped along with Jasper's to create Jaspro's Sprite Squared. Rose has a similar but distinct experience with JRS that Dirk does with Ark: disgust. Rose's disgust is not out of rejection, however, it is out of alienation. Dirk's disgust is originated with seeing a part of himself twisted beyond recognition, but Rose sees her own earnest traits reflected back at her with no filter. Her internal self is reflected back at her. All she can do then is scream into a pillow as the hyper-earnest JRS immediately sets about finding a girlfriend. Rose, who up until now has been a fairly confident person, is for the first time upset at herself. The others who know Rose aren't as alarmed at JRS because, of course, they already knew this side of their friend, but to Rose it's upsetting because JRS is expressing something that she preferred to keep private. It's as though her subconscious grew legs and whiskers. It would be upsetting to anyone, even if that person were at peace with themselves. We don't want to just go around telling people all of our deepest emotions. I quite like Rose's reaction to JRS because it's probably the single most relatable instance of self-recognition in the comic. Another case where two people are related enough to be the same different guy are the troll ancestors. Unlike the Dancestors, who are in many ways peers of the teen trolls, the ancestors are separated into their own time frame. Sadly, only a few ancestors actually interact in some way with their descendants. The relationship also goes the other way, in that the Dancestors would presumably have their own ancestors, dance ancestors perhaps, in the Before Us timeline, but sadly we never see those guys in Homestuck. The only two characters who actually speak to their descendants in some way are Mindfang and the Sufferer. Mindfang, for Vriska, is an aspirational figure. She represents not only someone who Vriska sees herself in, but someone she wants to see more of herself in. This is a nice contrast with how Vriska sees Arania and parenthesis Vriska. Mindfang is of course not the greatest role model, obviously, but Vriska reads her diary obsessively. We all have our heroes, of course, but this is hardly allegory. This is just Homestuck creating someone with a personal hero, but we can still read something into how Vriska sees Mindfang. Mindfang is fucking horrible, but Vriska has trouble seeing that and devotes a certain amount of mental effort trying to convince herself that Mindfang rules. The other ancestor who has some sway over their descendant is the Sufferer. Karkat doesn't ever speak to the Sufferer, of course, but even so, he shares his symbol with him, and the Sufferer made it possible for Karkat to be safe on segregated and genocidal Alternia. Sadly, this has something of the opposite effect, where Karkat is able to integrate possibly too much. He has none of the Sufferer's revolutionary spirit, and in fact would like to become someone part of Alternia's armies one day. Another set of self-expressions that can be found is in the Caretaker of Beck. Numerous diverse characters become, in part, Beck, from the imps of the Beta Session to the Black King and Queen, but more prominently, Jack, PM, and Jade herself. Beck isn't a character, as it were, but Beck's being binds these diverse characters together through his powers and traits. In late Act 6, during one of the final fights in Collide, Jade, Jack, and PM all come together in one altercation. Jade is shown to have an incredible mutual love for Beck, which expresses itself not only as self-love when the two are combined, but as love for even someone as despicable as Jack. Sadly, this effort is futile, but Jade's attempt to ameliorate Jack and PM's dispute shows perhaps the biggest moment of self-adoration in Homestuck. Another character who has many iterations, as it were, is Caliborn. Caliborn's self absorbs numerous different guys along his path to become Lord English, leading many people being related to him in some way. His main three alt-selves are Doc Scratch, Jack English, and of course, Lord English himself. Caliborn's self-experience is less upsetting to him as a being and more upsetting to the numerous others that can see themselves in him. He's less of a self, and he becomes more like a mirror. Dirk, for instance, through Ark's absorption into Ellie, sees himself. The trolls, through Doc Scratch's influence, all see themselves in Lord English. And Lord English, though he's the main bad guy of the comic, is, in a very real sense, a product of the entire narrative. On the same note as the cherubs, then, one could understand Calliope and Caliborn as the same guy, in a way. They share history and even a body, meaning they are ectobiologically identical, yet they are completely different expressions of the same person, leading them to have entirely different experiences and emotions, especially in how they interact with art. This same selfhood isn't explored much in Homestuck, but it's easy to think of all the characters in media with evil twins. The evil twin phenomenon is so interesting to the collective conscious because it's so easy to conceptualize ourselves as inverses, to apply some kind of opposite to our own beings. At the end of the day, no matter what we do, we are ourselves. Thinking of selves that aren't ourselves are a useful tool, however, in discovering where our self ends. Which traits, no matter how buried, aren't ours, which things we denounce, and which things we accept. All of this harkens back to the aforementioned two-center hypothesis. If the ego is the point in the middle, and the self is the surrounding areas, then the not-quite-self is that line that denotes the end of the self. It is our evil twin, so close, yet so far, a body discovering where it limits its consciousness. Much like we can't see the end of our vision, we can't truly see this line, but it helps us as beings to draw it ourselves, to say, this is outside and this is in. And at the same time, it can be a little upsetting to have things approach those boundaries and play with them. It just goes to show how much of ourself is a conscious choice that we are discovering and creating at once. Who are you? When identifying the self, it's vitally important to also identify the over-self. Up until now, we've dealt with selves in a reductive manner, as in which self exists as an expression of a self's own traits. But when considering the self, we must also consider the totality of the selves, plural. In Homestuck, this is quite a literal process. Adding up the selves into a so-called ultimate self is a concept named explicitly by the narrative. The ultimate self is largely a concept that's introduced in late Act 6 by Devepida, something that became a thematic item in Homestuck Squared, which is beyond the purview of this video. As Devepida says, everything that happens to every version of you is an important part of your ultimate self. Like a superseding bodiless and timeless persona that crosses the boundaries of paradox space, and unlike the god tiers or bubble ghosts, it really is immortal. I'm not completely sure because I'm not like some sort of aspect master, but my avian/feline intuition tells me that all roads will lead you there eventually. This they say to Jade when Jade says she no longer feels like a person. Critically, Jade says in the lead-up to this that she, quote, feels pretty sad that as I get closer to understanding my abilities and true nature, it apparently means being deprived of some important experiences. In Homestuck 1, and arguably its sequel, the ultimate self is not necessarily something that should be approached, but something that holds sway over us, personally. In Homestuck, there is a general rule. The further someone is from narrative constraint, the closer they are to happiness, with several very prominent examples. The two biggest embodiments of this concept are Jade and Vriska. Jade, in being more relevant to the story, is increasingly isolated and miserable, feeling in touch with her powers and abilities but without a purpose to give them to. Vriska, on the other hand, is similar, but more volatile. As she separates from relevance, she becomes more peaceful and happy, embodied in parenthesis Vriska, but she is ultimately required by the narrative, forcing her progress to regress to a hyper-aggressive persona embodied in regular post-game over Vriska. Dave, however, all the way through the beginning of Act 5, renounces his aspect in favor of personhood outright. Dave says, "It's more like what they say about karate, that you learn it so you don't use it. But I mean, we all know the truth about karate is if you know karate, then obviously in reality you use it all the time. But with time travel, all the stuff about learning it so you don't have to use it is true. There's no good that can come of it. You can crunch the logic on time loops all you want, but all you're doing is painting yourself into a corner." The idea, then, is to accept your over-self, but do not become it. Jade, who, when Dave says this, is Grimbark, feels more miserable and enraged the closer she gets to her over-self, whereas Dave wisely abandons his after gaining mastery over it. Understanding your ultimate self means giving up your, non-ultimate self, your mundane self. It means ego death. In theology, there's a concept known as the Godhead. The Godhead is the unknowable, unfathomable true form of God expressed to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, all three things that are in their own way distinct and knowable, yet part of a greater whole. The Godhead, then, is only truly knowable by the space these other selves leave in their wake, what they have in common, and what they imply by their existence. People, too, have a Godhead. As stated in the two selves hypothesis, there is an ego, the broad self, and the membrane around it, but all these spheres lead back into something bigger, something more potent, something immaculate, our own Godhead. In Homestuck, we might understand the ultimate self as the Godhead where individuals trace back to what every character is a part of. We might say there is a Dirk Godhead, an ephemeral being with heart powers who wears triangle shades and is in control. We might go further back and see the Strider Godhead, a being with sunglasses, a calm demeanor, and struggles with internality. Even further, and we find the Stryland Godhead, where there is a Durst dreamer who guards themselves with stoic sarcasm. In a less pretentious way, we might understand these Godheads as archetypes, but not in the Jungian sense, not in the commonly shared stories and characters, but of the more deep-rooted sense, where each person expresses some certain traits. In Homestuck, we might see the Egbert archetype, bespectacled pranksters with a penchant for obliviousness. Further back, we might see the Egbert Harley Crocker English archetype, bespectacled prospect dreamers who are moved by the world around them with untold powers. There are more Godhead archetypes in Homestuck too, as they are not only a useful analytical tool, but an excellent writing one as well. The 12 Trolls have 12 archetypes of their own, diverse expressions of a handful of traits. The Circuit Godhead, wordy blue bloods with a need for relevance. The Pisces Godhead, controlling fuchsia bloods oozing condescension. One could be formulated for each in turn. This is all well and good for a story like Homestuck, but what about humans in the real world? You know, you and me. Much like Vriska, we as humans are built on our experiences. We all have slivers of others in us. A teacher we looked up to, our parents, an embarrassing kid who we didn't like. All of these people have an effect on who we are. They are expressed in us in some minuscule way. Take all of those influences and we can begin to see Godheads in our own lives. A man who makes music based on metal bands he likes is expressing the metal Godhead through his music. A painter who makes art inspired by Picasso expresses the abstract painting Godhead. We often imagine that we are making something when we create art, but really we are playing a role that already existed, that has some root far back in human history too vague to comprehend, an indescribable, incomprehensible whole. We are then all part of the human Godhead, and beyond that, the animal Godhead, the earth Godhead, and finally, the universe itself. And yet, who are you? It's empowering to feel like you're part of something. Anyone who's taken LSD can tell you what I just did in the same breathlessly optimistic way, but at the same time, none of this changes where you are. None of it changes where you go to work tomorrow. The Godhead isn't real, it's a concept created to chip away at your ego. It's words being told at you through a computer. The Godhead doesn't change anything, it just zooms the focus out until everything is the same color. That's all well and good and fascinating to explore, but it doesn't answer the question we keep coming back to. It just fills the space near it. The Godhead tells us where the self is. It can tell us how to reach it, but much like a blue sunny sky, we can enjoy the clouds and the baby blue, but we shouldn't look at the sun until we're ready to be blinded. The Godhead is there for when our self isn't real anymore. But what about right now? What about me? What about you? What about the self? What about who are you? So after all this, after seeing all the selves meeting themselves and all the selves in between, what does Homestuck tell us about the self as a concept? What can we as selves discern about our reality? Through Homestuck, we see three types of selves: same self, self, and other self. They're all expressed through a staggeringly diverse sense of specific circumstances, but they all hint towards a general continuum of how we as people can understand our own lives in their totality. This, to be clear, is a theory of reality in its most subjective sense. It's not a theory about reality as it is, of mundane things like trees, wind, fire, atoms, and space, but a reality of the perceived. Homestuck aims to pin down just where our self-awareness begins and ends. Much like the aforementioned two-center hypothesis written about by Jung, there are other models that have tried to pin down just what the fuck we are. There are a number of Freudian and Jungian hypotheses about the self, but in my frank opinion, though Freud and Jung are compelling, their ideas are out of date and fraught with delusion. In spite of numerous scholars drawing from these two men about numerous things, from Jordan Peterson to Joseph Campbell, Jung and Freud both try to grapple with concepts as totality instead of trying to use them as a lens through which to understand something. The self is not a singular, definable thing. The self, in a very real sense, is the largest unit of anything we experience. It begins when we're born, and it ends when we die, and our shitty memories keep a poorly kept record of it. It is the totality of reality, yet a tiny sliver of the universe. Jung and Freud try to be done with the self. They try to define it and move on, but this lacks insight. A more fluid take on self, one that more closely follows Homestuck's own portrayal, can be found in the work of Charles Cooley, a sociologist from the 80s, who built up on the idea that our self-concepts are largely built by others. There are three main components to this looking-glass self. 1, our imagined appearance to others. 2, our imagined judgment from others. And 3, our sense of self through response to these imaginings. Human beings change their behavior based on perception. It's rather impossible not to do this, as even if we are apathetic to others' feelings, it still affects our mood. We imagine a certain noble virtue in not caring what others think, but this is largely an impossibility. In Freudian terms, we can't escape our own superego. The superego is not external, it's inside all of us. Homestuck's characters are, to some extent, looking into this looking glass. They're seeing some version of themselves and reacting to it based on their perceived idea of how they should act, as imposed by the numerous societies these characters hail from. But instead of a looking glass, these characters in Homestuck experience the self in a real way as other autonomous beings in the real world. This idea stems from the idea of social constructivism, a 20th century psychological concept. Another scholar, George Herbert Mead, came up with the theory of the social self, which posited two sides of a larger self, much like Jung's two-center hypothesis. The two sides of the self, being the me and the I, constitute two different self-experiences. There's the me, or the things that we learn by interacting with other humans, from how to use a spoon to what a tree is. This is in contrast to the I, which is the needs we have most innately, like hunger and sexual arousal. The line between these is somewhat faint, but it's similar to Freud's id and ego with some more nuance. Mead's work leads us further in to his musing on what's known as the generalized other. In simple terms, the general other is a self's concept of what others think of them, constantly evaluated, even without others. For instance, if you wanted to steal a loaf of bread, you might choose not to, even if you could get away with it, because of your general other, the idea that you aren't living up to the expectation of others or yourself in society. This is not a moral belief, and more a form of humans participating in team building. The general other is the reason we can act in accordance with sports teams and in jobs, by acting in accordance with inherited expectations. This is all to say, we can only see who we are through the lens of others. Homestuck turns this inward and asks its characters to see themselves from their own lens, to weigh themselves by their own scale. In this way, they advance the ideas of Mead and Cooley, where they ask, how do we see ourselves in relation to others? Homestuck asks, how do we see ourselves in relation to ourselves? It's something of a paradox, but it's comprehensible. Each example of someone meeting themselves in Homestuck has some element of a relatable, grounded, lived human experience, as I've discussed in the previous parts. Our self-awareness begins when we realize we exist, something we do passively as living beings. It extends to meta-awareness when we realize that other humans also contain that consciousness. Through this recognition, we recognize that something approaches the self, and finally, the sense of the meta-self evolves into one of the most basic human emotions, empathy. Each type of self in Homestuck corresponds to this chain. When characters see their same selves, like Dave sees his time clones, he gains meta-awareness. When Dirk sees himself in his works, like Hal, he recognizes the self. And finally, when Rose sees Jasperos, she understands them, leading to an increased understanding of herself, a sort of self-empathy. You might have noticed that this is recursive. You understand your own being only by understanding others, and by understanding others, you understand your own being, etc., etc. Now, let's be clear, this is all fine and dandy, but what are we supposed to do with this? It's easy enough to say these things and easy enough to understand. Easy enough theoretically, but what does it mean for our behavior as our own autonomous selves? Assuming we have free will at all, but that's another video. The final step of the equation here, as stated, is empathy. You might notice, however, that not everyone has empathy. Empathy isn't some instinct we're born with, and not on a broad scale at least, and it's not something endemic to society, not something we really learn, as it were. Sure, we can be taught what empathy is, but how do you practice it? Once we recognize that we exist, we don't necessarily accept that others exist. Famously, it's impossible to prove that someone else is conscious. I think, therefore I am. No one can prove they think unless they are themselves. This is all to say that empathy is an active process. Having faith that others have self and respecting it opens this massive spiraling path of not only discovery of others, but discovery of ourselves. By empathy, I mean it in the most positive sense, like accepting that we as living human beings can have the capacity of skill and beauty as the best among us. But it's also negative, like accepting that we, given the wrong step, could become a murderer or a pedophile. Empathy in the most broad, most humanitarian sense means accepting everything. The best, worst, and acting accordingly. It means not placing the greatest men on pedestals and not condemning the worst criminals. It means seeing ourselves in others, even people we despise or hold aloft. Once you see yourself in the other, you unlock unfathomable potential as well as dizzying depths of depravity. It means accepting that you are you, and only you, yet you are every other human person with a spark behind their eyes. It means you are connected to the Godhead. You are an expression of unfathomably many things that you can't comprehend down through the consciousnesses of trillions of humans and quadrillions of animals before that and quintillions of atoms before that. But you're also just wherever you are and whatever you are at the moment. It's mundane, but it's impossibly unfathomable. It's the answer to that question. Who are you? The self is a tricky thing to pin down. That's always fascinating because the self, as stated, is literally the beginning and ending of our entire experience. It's so hard to define, yet it's the single most fundamental unit. Even the dictionary definition sounds absolutely fucking ridiculous. Here it is. A person's essential being that distinguishes them from others, especially considered as the object of introspection or reflective action. What? That doesn't even get into consciousness or the ego or anything, and it's still word salad. This whole essay is word salad. Writing something like this is a massive undertaking because it's a lot of words about something that is fundamentally impossible to put into words. And worse, it's through the lens of a webcomic that hasn't been relevant since, 2012. But even aside from that, I made it, so now it exists, and as always, I'm making that your problem. It was a long road, but we're at the end of it, and there's no unwalking it for myself nor for you, the humble listener. Maybe something in there was worth your time. Maybe something was there to be appreciated or learned. So, what did we learn today? Let's summarize. We learned that 1, Homestuck is a webcomic where people meet themselves sometimes, and 2, you are you. Congratulations, I'm glad we could establish this. My PayPal is funkmclovinmusic@gmail.com. I will be accepting donations indefinitely. Please contact the same email address for inquiries about honorary PhD awards. Thank you. Also, I want to add at the end of this, I didn't write this in the script or anything. If you watch Everything Everywhere All at Once, you will understand this essay. That's all. Thank you.